The first thing Sergeant Yara Osi noticed when the radar went dark was the silence. Not the silence of equipment failure. She'd heard that before. The soft pop of a blown relay, and then the white hiss of static. This was different. This was the silence of everything outside stopping at once. The wind, which had screamed at 50 knots against the curved walls of Station Kestrel for 3 consecutive days, simply ceased. As if something very large had stepped between the station and the sky, she stood from her console. The other 2 personnel on shift, Corporal Dax and Private Yoon, were already looking at each other. "Check the exterior sensors," Yara said. Dax pulled up the feed. The screen showed nothing but white. Not a whiteout, not snow static. Just white, filling the lens, too close and too vast to resolve into any shape. Then the wall groaned. Not the familiar groan of thermal expansion. Kestrel was 60 years old and groaned in 17 different registers. And she knew each one the way she knew her own heartbeat. This groan came from outside and moved through the composite shell like sound through water, low and deep enough to feel in the chest. The groan of something alive pressing against the station's northern wall. "Get on the emergency line," Yara said, already moving toward the gear locker. "Command anyone. Get on the line now." She heard Dax reaching for the handset. She heard his voice go very careful and steady the way voices do when the body understands something the brain is still refusing. She pulled on her thermal layer and reached for the wall-mounted rifle, which was meant for bears and survey disputes, and had never been fired in anger in her 4-year posting. She never heard the roof give way. The after-action report filed 2 weeks later by Colonel Sarge Hyen Park of the Unified Orbital Flux Monitoring Directorate described Station Kestrel's destruction as sudden and total, consistent with extreme compressive force applied from above. The report noted that no remains were recovered. The report used the word consistent 14 times and the word unknown 7 times. It was 7 more times than Hyun had ever used it in a professional document, and she had been writing professional documents for 22 years. She read the preliminary field analysis in her office at Talon Base, in the Kepler mountain range, 1,200 kilometers south of where Kestrel had been. Outside her window, the sky was the particular blue of high altitude in autumn, the kind of blue that looks like a promise and delivers cold. The analysis had come through on a secured line at 034, and she had not gone back to sleep. What remained of the site, per the drone survey, was a compressed disk of metal and insulation approximately 4 meters deep at its lowest point. Whatever had struck it had not landed. There were no impact vectors consistent with a falling body. The compression was even, gradual, as if something had simply settled its weight onto the station and remained there. Around the perimeter of the disk, in the frozen ground, were marks. Port described them as parallel linear depressions, asymmetric, recurring at irregular intervals of approximately 18 to 22 meters, depth varying from 60 centimeters to 1.2 meters. The drone photographs showed them extending north by northwest until they, below the horizon scan range. Hayan looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she called Dr. Fen Soraya. Fen was not military and had never been military, and announced this approximately once every 40 minutes, whenever she found herself on base, which was whenever something sufficiently inexplicable had been dug up, thawed out, or shot down, and nobody could say what it was. She was a xenobiologist by training, which in practice meant she had spent 15 years cataloging the biological signatures of non-terrestrial organisms recovered from survey probes, all of which had been microbial, all of which had been dead for geological epochs, and none of which had prepared her in the slightest for the photographs Hyen sent her at 04:20 on a Tuesday morning in October. Fen studied the photographs the way she studied everything, without speaking, turning them in her mind, looking for the shape beneath the shape. She had a habit of pressing her thumb against her lower lip when she was thinking, a habit she'd had since she was 8 and had never once managed to break. "The stride interval," she said finally, "suggests something with a limb reach of at least." She stopped. "At least what?" Hayan said. "I need to see the scale markers in the original drone file." Hayan sent them. The silence on the line lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Hayan timed it. "Hayan," Fen's voice had changed, not frightened exactly. Fen didn't frighten easily. Changed the way a room changes when someone walks in who changes rooms. I need you to look at Appendix C of the field survey, the fragment they pulled from the wreckage. Hyun had already looked at it. The fragment was approximately 90 centimeters long, curved, semi-transparent, amber-tinted at its thicker end. It had been catalogued as possible structural material, origin unknown. The xenobiology lab had flagged it as organic without being able to say more. It's a spur, Fen said, from a limb joint. The geometry is unmistakable once you know what you're looking at. She paused. Hyun, the organism that left those marks in the tundra, based on stride interval, limb geometry, and the weight distribution implied by the compression depth. I need to run the full model before I give you a confident number. My working estimate is something in the range of 60 to 90 meters in length. Another pause, and I think it's heading south. The briefing at Talon Base 3 days later was the most quietly terrifying meeting Hyun had ever attended, and she had once sat in a room while two admirals argued about whether to disclose first contact protocols to the sitting government. General Moss, who commanded the Northern Hemisphere monitoring network, sat at the head of the table and listened to Fen's presentation with the patient expression, hearing something he already knew was going to ruin his week and had made his peace with it. Fen had the photographs up on the main screen. She walked through the biology methodically, the way she always did. No drama, no build-up, just the shape of the thing as the evidence described it. Limbs geometry consistent with an arthropod body plan, bilateral symmetry, the fragment's cartilage structure. Placed it in no known genus, but showed characteristics associated with the Mantidae order. Praying mantises, scaled to a degree that suggested the specimen had been preserved rather than evolved. Not a mutation, not a lab creation, something old, woken up. The tundra permafrost in the impact zone of the Kessler Ridge calving event 3 weeks ago, Fen said, shows a displacement cavity, approximately 90 meters in its longest dimension at a depth of 40 meters. Given the timing, she clicked to the next slide, and the directional tracking of the marks post-kestrel, looking at something that was encased in the ice for a very long time and is now moving. Moving where? Said General Moss. Track vector suggests south-southwest. Best current estimate puts it somewhere in the boreal zone within 4 to 5 days, depending on whether it's traveling at night. Is it traveling at night? Fen pressed her thumb against her lip. The thermal anomaly we picked up on the northern satellite pass last night suggests yes. Hyun watched General Moss absorb this. He was 61, gray-haired, built like a man who had once been very strong, and had simply never stopped being that way. He had a reputation for not wasting words, and she had always respected it. Recommendations, he said. Full satellite track, Hyun said. Everything we have on the northern grid repositioned to continuous coverage. We need to know where it is every hour, and we need to establish a contact perimeter. Not intercept, not yet. We don't know what we're dealing with well enough to go in hot. Agreed. He looked at Fen. What do we need to know before we go in hot? Fen thought about it. How it responds to threat. Whether it's acting on instinct or something more. Whether there are more of them. She paused. Chemical agents can penetrate an exoskeletal structure at that scale. Because conventional ordnance will slow it down. I'm not sure it will stop it. The silence in the room after that sat on everyone's chest like a hand. They tracked it for 4 days. The satellite logs, which Hyun reviewed each morning, with coffee, she stopped tasting somewhere around day 2, showed the creature moving with a consistency that was either reassuring or alarming, depending on what kind of person you were. It was not erratic. It was not panicking. It moved south-southwest at a steady pace, pausing in the pre-dawn hours and during mid-afternoon, the pauses suggesting Fen's working model, thermal regulation, a cold-blooded biology working through the arithmetic of a world several million years warmer than one it had known. It avoided human settlements. Whether this was deliberate intelligence or simple biology following the path of least resistance, no one could say. It ate twice. The first time was a survey depot north of the tree line, unmanned, sensors only, nothing but the aftermath to examine. The second time was a weather observation post with 3 personnel. The emergency evacuation order had gone out 6 hours before the creature's projected arrival. 2 of the 3 made it out. The third, a young analyst named Cadet Piers Ewan, no relation to the Ewan at Kestrel, though Hayan would remember both names for the rest of her life, had stayed behind to pull the sensor array data because he'd believed, correctly, that it was the best behavioral record they had. His last transmission was 22 seconds of wind noise and one sentence. It's not moving like something hunting. It's moving like something that knows exactly where it is. After that, Hayan stopped sleeping. Fen worked around the clock in the lab they'd set up for her, on base level 4, surrounded by models and projection screens and what appeared, at any given hour, to be an architectural diagram of an animal that had no business existing. She ate when some put food in front of her. She had 3 changes of clothes and wore the same one for 36 hours at a time, without noticing. On the morning of the 4th day, she called Hayan down. "I know how to kill it," she said, without preamble, which was how Fen said everything. She had a holographic projection of the organism's reconstructed anatomy rotating slowly in the center of the lab. The exoskeleton is dense. Conventional explosive ordnance will cause surface damage, but the structural integrity will hold up to everything short of a direct bunker-grade strike, and even then we're talking about wound damage, not systemic shutdown. So we can't just bomb it. We can hurt it. We can't stop it that way. Fen pointed to the projection's thorax, the complex architecture of a chest cavity 60 meters above the ground. Molecular respiration. Arthropods breathe through a series of openings in the exoskeleton. Spiracles that feed a tracheal network. At this scale, that tracheal network has to be extraordinarily efficient to oxygenate a body this size, which means the spiracles are correspondingly large and the interior passages correspondingly open. She turned to face Hayan. If you can get a high-concentration chemical agent into those passages, something that disrupts cellular respiration at the mitochondrial level, you don't fight it, you suffocate it from the inside. Hayan looked at the projection. How do you deliver it? Aerosol. It has to breathe the compound in, and it has to breathe enough of it that the concentration reaches critical threshold before the tracheal passages seal in response, which means you need to get it into an enclosed space, or you need to create an enclosed space around it. An enclosed space or find one. Fence looked at her steadily. It's heading south-southwest. If it holds to this vector, and the terrain modeling suggests it will, because the gradient descent makes it easier for something this size to move. It reaches the lowland industrial corridor in approximately 36 to 40 hours. Hayan looked at the terrain map on the adjacent screen. The industrial corridor. Road tunnels, utility conduits. The old coastal rail tunnel at Ferris Point, 11 kilometers long, designed to withstand a century of mountain pressure, sealed at both ends. She looked at Fen. "We'd be driving it there," Hayan said. "Yes, which means getting close enough to drive something 90 meters long in a specific direction." "Yes. Using what?" Fen picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, put it down. "That part is your department." Hayan spent 2 hours with her tactical staff working the problem. She spent another 2 hours on a secured call with General Moss, who listened, asked 3 questions, approved the operation, and said, "Don't lose anyone you don't have to," in a way that acknowledged the clause while they both understood it. She spent 40 minutes on a second call she didn't document to a number she kept in her head, asking a man she'd served with for 9 years to meet her at a forward staging point 60 kilometers north of Ferris Point. Lieutenant Commander Dae Jung arrived at the staging area at 200 in a stripped-down transport with 8 people she'd handpicked, and a look on his face that meant he had read the briefing and processed it, and landed somewhere past fear in the territory that has no good name. He and Hayan went off to a corner of the staging tent and talked for 12 minutes in voices no one else could hear. When they came back, his expression had resolved into something workable. "We're the noise," he said to his team. "We're the noise," they agreed. It was not the most reassuring thing Hayan had ever heard, but was honest, which she valued. The plan was this: 2 aviation assets, armed drones, no pilots at risk, would make first contact with the creature and establish a threat vector, driving it southwest. Ground teams and fast movers would track and vector, maintaining enough presence to keep the creature oriented toward the corridor without triggering Combat response that might turn it or stop it or cause it to go vertical. The Ferris Point tunnel, meanwhile, would be prepared. Both entry points sealed by blast doors the second the creature was confirmed inside. Aerosol dispersal units already positioned in the maintenance shafts, enough of Fenn's compound in the system to fill the tunnel 3 times over. Fenn herself would be at the monitoring station half a kilometer from the eastern portal. She had not been invited and had not asked. She had simply shown up at the transport and looked at Heian in a way that ended the conversation before it started. They made contact at 0347. The drones found it 4 kilometers north of the projected position, which meant it had been moving faster than the model predicted. Or had sensed them before they found it. The first drone operator's voice on the comm was an exercise in studied calm. Visual confirmed. Subject is stationary. Pete, subject is stationary and appears to be a pause. It's looking at us. Heian's jaw tightened. Execute approach vector. The drones angled south, making noise, firing a ranging burst into the ground ahead of the creature. Not at it, never at it. Enough to establish a threat vector, to say, danger is this way, not that way. She watched the drone feed on her screen. Creature was immense in a way that feeds, and models, and projections had not prepared her for. It was immense the way a mountain is immense. The way standing at the base of a cliff is immense. Not because of the number in meters, but because of the simple biological fact of something that large occupying space that you are also occupying. It moved. Not the way she'd expected something that size to move. Not ponderous, not slow. Not the movie creature lumber of her imagination. It moved the way its smaller ancestors moved, with a precision that was almost delicate, each limb placed with what looked like deliberateness. The great head pivoting on its triangular geometry, to track the drones with the kind of focused attention that made something cold walk up her spine. It was not afraid of the drones. It was deciding about the drones. There was a quality to the attention she did not have a word for, and did not want one. It moved southwest. 3 hours. Heian watched on screens and through the windows of her forward vehicle, as the creature moved through terrain that reshaped itself. Around it, stands of trees pressed flat, a frozen lake crossed in 8 strides. The drone operators working in shifts to maintain the gentle pressure of the threat vector without escalating, without triggering the combat response they had all agreed they could not afford. Daejung's ground teams tracked parallel, staying in dead ground, staying quiet, running dark. The ground shook. Not dramatically, not like a film. It was a constant low vibration, something below the threshold of sound. Something the body registered before the mind, like the feeling of standing near very large machinery that has not yet decided whether to notice you. At 0611, Fenn's voice came over the command channel. It's detouring, she said. Heian looked at the tracking screen. The creature had angled west, away from the corridor vector. Why? There's a settlement 3 kilometers west of your position. Small, 40 people, maybe 50. It may have detected them. Does it hunt by heat signature? I don't know. A pause. Heian. If it turns west, we lose the corridor option. There's no second tunnel in this region. We'd have to go kinetic and hope. Heian did not look at anyone. She looked at the tracking screen, and she thought about 40 people, and she thought about what a go kinetic and hope meant against something 90 meters long, with an exoskeleton that laughed at conventional ordnance, and she made a decision she would think about for the rest of her life. Daejung, she said. Take your team west of the creature's current position. Make noise. Give it something louder than the settlement. 2-second silence. Understood. She watched the locator dots of Daejung's team move on the screen. 8 people in fast movers, driving west-northwest, and then she heard over the comm the sound of their engines opening up. Not hiding, not quiet. Just 8 vehicles, driving flat out across frozen ground, making every sound 8 vehicles could make. She watched the creature's track on the screen. She watched it pause. She watched it turn. It tracked toward the noise, not toward the settlement. It came back to course as if it had made a calculation and reached a conclusion. And the conclusion had the quality. She would never say this in any report. She would never be able to say it in any report. Of having been reached by something that understood its options. South-southwest, toward the corridor, toward the tunnel. Daejung's team pulled away, staying west, keeping the noise going, keeping the creature oriented. It followed the path of apparent least resistance the way the terrain model had said it would, the great body moving through the boreal edge in pre-dawn dark, the frozen ground registering each footfall like a drumbeat. Heian thought briefly about the ice it had come from, about how long it had slept in the dark. She thought about what it must be like to wake up in a world that had moved on without you by several million years, and find that the world was smaller than you remembered, louder than you remembered, and full of things that none of your instincts had been designed for. She stopped thinking about it. She had 40 people 3 kilometers west, and a tunnel to fill. At 082, the creature reached the outskirts of the industrial corridor. The corridor at dawn was already evacuated, had been evacuated for 18 hours since the operation order went out, though evacuating an industrial corridor was a phrase that translated in practice to 600 vehicles on 4 roads in the dark, and a regional emergency manager named Supervisor Tran, who had coordinated it all on 4 hours sleep and a personality trait that Heiyun privately classified as structured rage. When Heiyun had called her at 0200 the previous day to explain the situation, Supervisor Tran had asked 2 questions. How long do I have and what can I use? And then had gotten off the line and not called back to complain, Qian, which here considered one of the finer demonstrations of professionalism she had ever witnessed. The eastern portal of the Ferris Point Tunnel stood at the end of a long declining grade. A natural funnel was why the terrain model had flagged it. The creature was moving downgrade, which its biology preferred. The drones kept their position. Daejung's team had come back around, prone to the north, staying back, maintaining the pressure of the threat vector from behind. Dispersal units confirm ready, said the engineer on Heian's comm, both portal blast doors on remote. Chemical load at 100%. Fen, Heian said. Ready, Fen said. Her voice was steady. Heian had always appreciated that about her. The creature reached the eastern portal at 0847. It paused. On the drone feed, Heian watched the great triangular head lower, the antennae extending toward the tunnel opening with what looked teskly like curiosity. The tunnel entrance was 11 meters tall and 18 meters wide. It had been built for the heaviest freight transport in the region. The creature was 90 meters long. The opening was inadequate by every obvious measure, and yet the head went in. Heian heard her own breath. The head went in, and then the thorax followed, and the geometry of the thing resolving into the tunnel entrance was wrong, in a way the eye kept trying to correct. Too large, all wrong, the scale refusing to normalize. And she gripped the edge of her console and watched the tracking screen and said nothing. It's folding, said the drone operator, voice cracking on the last word before the professionalism caught up. The limbs are folding. It's compressing itself into the tracking shows front section at 40 meters inside, said the engineer. 50, 60. Tail section was still outside. The blast doors couldn't close on the tail section. Heian made herself breathe. Daejung, she said. I need it all the way in. Another 2-second silence. She could hear faintly him thinking. The tunnel's got a grade break at 70 meters. If there's something it doesn't like past that point. Something it doesn't like, she said. Yeah. She heard the decision being made, the same way she heard her own decisions being made, the quiet click of a conclusion reached. Give me 60 seconds. She watched the locator dot move on the screen. Daejung's vehicle separating from his team. Moving toward the tunnel entrance, moving close. Preacher's tail section was still outside. Still outside, she heard, over the comm, the sound of a single vehicle driving directly at the tunnel entrance. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. The tail moved. Not a lunge. It didn't react the way a threatened animal reacts, with the explosion of instinct. It moved the way it had been moving all night. Precision. With what she could not stop herself from reading as deliberateness, as if it had considered the vehicle and decided the vehicle was behind it, and it did not want to be surprised from behind. Tail segments drew inward. The last limb vanished into the tunnel. Blast doors, Heian said. The blast doors came down. She heard them on the audio feed. The great composite slabs dropping into their housings, with a sound like the world closing a book. She watched the tracking signal inside the tunnel on the ground radar, the creature's movement. Still forward, still deeper in. Still. And then she heard the first vibration through the ground sensors, deep and resonant, and she understood that it had reached the grade break and found the end of the tunnel beyond it, and understood that it was enclosed. Dispersal, she said. Dispersing, said the engineer. The chemical dispersal system had been designed by Fen and built by people who had been told only that it was for confined atmospheric modification and had been very well paid not to ask more. It fed from maintenance shaft access points at 20-meter intervals along the tunnel's length, timed to release simultaneously and sustain concentration for 12 minutes. The compound itself had no smell that human senses could detect. It had been tested on arthropod tissue samples scaled to the target biology. Fen had been very quiet about the test results and had not shared them unprompted. But when Heian had asked directly, she'd said, "It'll work. Time." Heian gave it time. The tunnel shook for 11 minutes. Not continuously, in rhythms, each one longer than the last, each one deeper, each one carrying less force than the one before it. She listened to those rhythms the way she'd listened to the groans of station kestrel in its 17 registers, trying to read meaning into sound, trying to know. Her team around her was silent. On the audio feed, the groaning was vast and strange, and she could not fully separate the biological from the geological, not tell where the creature ended, and the mountain began. At the 14-minute mark, the tunnel stopped shaking. Silence held for 8 minutes before anyone spoke. "Tracking signal is stationary," said the engineer, very quietly. Heian looked at the screen. The signal was stationary. No movement, no vibration on the ground sensors. The blast doors were holding. The aerosol readings inside the tunnel were still a concentration. Fen came through the monitoring station door. She was moving fast, not quite running, looking at her tablet. She looked at the tracking display. She looked at the aerosol readings. She pressed her thumb against her lower lip. "It stopped," Heian said. "I know." Fen studied the readings for a long moment. "Give it another 20 minutes before we crack the doors. You think I think what the data says." Fen glanced at her. 20 minutes. They gave it 22. The blast door on the eastern portal opened by 10 centimeters and a drone went in, running a sensor suite and a camera, moving slow and low along the tunnel. Floor-past cars pressed flat against the walls by the passage of something vast. Past ceiling lights that had been sheared away. Past the grade break at 70 meters. Where the tunnel curved and the darkness was absolute. Heian watched the drone feed on her screen. The feed showed a wall. The wall was amber-tinted, curved, textured like stone. It filled the tunnel from floor to ceiling and extended. The drone's range sensors confirmed. From the 40-meter mark to the western portal, 140 meters. The creature had folded itself into the space with the same precision it had shown all night, the same deliberateness, and lay there now without moving in the darkness. The air sensors showed compound concentration at 8% above threshold. Heian stood and looked at the feed for a very long time. Daejung came in from outside, still in his kit, smelling of cold and exhaust. He stood next to her and looked at the same feed. He was quiet for a moment. "What does it feel like," he said finally, "to be the oldest thing alive and wake up and find out the world doesn't have room for you anymore?" Heian thought about this. She thought about a creature that had slept in ice for an epoch, and woken up into a world of radar and tunnels and chemical agents that had moved south with precision and deliberateness, that had calculated its options in a frozen landscape and chosen the path of least escalation, until something had closed around it in the dark. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think I want to." She thought about Sergeant OC's, and the 2 Ewans, and the analyst who had stayed behind for the sensor data and said, in his last transmission, that the thing moved like it knew where it was. She thought about 40 people in a settlement that still existed. She thought about Daejung driving his vehicle at a tunnel entrance in the dark, alone, move something 90 meters long by 3 seconds of proximity. "Good work," she said, which was not enough, which was all she had. "Yeah," he said. Fen was already on the comm to the recovery engineering team, already moving to the next problem, because the next problem was real and immediate and enormous. Literally enormous, and it needed solving. What to do with something 90 meters long and prehistoric and irreplaceable that was lying in a tunnel under a mountain range and what it meant that it had existed and been preserved and woken up, and whether the ice it had come from had more of the same, and whether the ice was melting faster than anyone had modeled, and what the hell kind of world they were living in that now had this in it. Preliminary study team arrived in 4 days. The first xenobiology team from the Orbital Research Division took 11. They came with equipment no one had ever needed before, and frameworks that didn't fit, and a lot of very careful language about specimen integrity, and controlled environment assessment, and Fen worked with all of them and disagreed with most of them, and was usually right. Hien filed her reports. All of them. Including the one about the 40 people and the decision she'd made to put Dae-jung's team in the creature's path, which she wrote carefully and accurately, and did not try to make sound better than it was. General Moss read it and called her, and they had a short conversation that ended with him saying, "Noted," in a tone that meant he understood, and she, hear nothing more about it, which was its own kind of weight to carry. 3 weeks after the Ferris Point operation, satellite the Kessler Ridge calving zone detected 2 new displacement cavities, each approximately the size of the first one. Hien was in her office when the notification came through. She read it twice. She forwarded it to Fen without comment. Com buzzed 4 minutes later. "I see it," Fen said. A pause. Outside the window, the sky was the same deep autumn blue. Kind of blue that looks like a promise. "I'll need a bigger lab," Fen said. "I'll get you one." Another pause longer. "Hien, first time we tracked it. The first 3 days before contact. The behavioral model kept flagging an anomaly I didn't mention in the briefs, because I couldn't figure out what it meant. A beat. It wasn't just heading south. It was moving in search patterns. Regular, systematic, covering ground the way you'd cover ground if you were looking for something." Hien said nothing. "I think it was looking for the others." The office was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up against the glass, the first edge of the season coming in from the north, smelling something older than snow. "Then we better find them first," Hien said. She pulled up the satellite feed. The 2 new displacement cavities sat in the ice 3 kilometers apart, north-northeast of the first. The imagery was current, from the morning pass. Both cavities were empty. She forwarded the imagery to Dae-jung with a single line, "Stand by." She forwarded it to General Moss with the preliminary recommendation that they begin the third option planning they had, until this moment, been calling the contingency no one wanted to think about. She forwarded it to Supervisor Tran with a courtesy message that read, "You're going to need more vehicles." Then she sat, for a moment, with her hands flat on the desk and looked at the bluescent sky through the window and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe when you are about to begin something that will not be over for a long time. There is a certain kind of person who looks at a problem the size of a mountain and doesn't flinch, not because they're not afraid. They're afraid. They're almost always afraid. But because fear and action are not exclusive, because the human animal is, in the final accounting, the animal that stays. That makes the call at Eero 2 Undero. That drives the vehicle toward the dark. That catalogs the anatomy of something it has no framework for, calmly, precisely, because the work needs doing and someone has to do it, and here they are. The ice was moving. The things in the ice were waking up. The world had changed in a way that did not ask permission, and did not offer warnings. And the people looking at that change from a small office in a mountain range had maybe 4 days before the next set of displacement signatures showed up on the feed, and the whole problem got larger. Hien Park picked up her phone. She had calls to make. The second cavity opened at 0340 on a Thursday, and the third at 0911 the same morning, and, by noon, General Moss had convened an emergency session that included, for the first time, representatives from 3 other national defense commands who had been monitoring the satellite data in silence for 48 hours, and had decided, apparently simultaneously, that silence was no longer sustainable. The meeting was held on a secure video channel. Helen attended from her office with Fen beside her. The other faces on the screen were tired in the way that people are tired when they have been carrying information they could not share, and the weight of it has been accumulating for longer than they would admit. There were 6 of them. She recognized 2. The other 4 were careful with their names. What the meeting established, over the course of 90 minutes, was this. The Kessler Ridge event was not isolated. In the preceding 8 weeks, 4 other calving events of unusual depth and dimension had been recorded in 3 separate Arctic ice sheets. 2 had been attributed to accelerating melt dynamics. 1 had been flagged as anomalous but unresolved. 1 had not been flagged at all, because the monitoring station covering that sector had gone offline 6 weeks prior due to equipment failure, which was the phrase in the incident log, and which no one had looked at closely, because equipment in the Arctic failed constantly, and the log was very long. The monitoring station had not suffered equipment failure. Fen sat very still when this was confirmed. Heian watched her from the corner of her eye. Fen had been still in that particular way, the stillness of a mind running very fast behind a face that had decided not to show it, since the second displacement cavity appeared. Since Heian had told her the night before what the behavioral data from the tunnel had shown in the final hour of the operation. Heard the data that Heian had not put in the primary report because she had not known what to do with it. Creature in the tunnel had not behaved randomly in its final minutes. The ground sensor array, which had been running continuously throughout the operation, had captured the full movement record. When Heian had reviewed it the evening after Ferris Point, with the raw feed and a signal processing analyst named Warrant Officer Desch, who had the habit of going very quiet when something bothered him, they had found a pattern in the last 8 minutes of movement. Not random, not panic, rhythmic, structured, repeating at regular intervals. "What is that?" Heian had said, watching the sensor output on the screen. "Don't know," Desch had said, which from him meant he knew, and was taking a moment to decide how to say it. He'd pulled up a secondary display. "It's a low-frequency mechanical vibration. Source is the organism. Pattern repeats every 42 seconds with variation of plus or minus 3 seconds. Spectral signature is..." He'd paused. "It's not a distress signal. Distress vocalizations in arthropods are typically aperiodic, random, high-intensity bursts. This is structured. What does structured look like in arthropods?" Desch had been very quiet for a moment. Communication. Heian had sat with that for a long time. She sat with it again now, in the meeting room on the secure channel, listening to the representatives from 3 national commands discuss extraction timelines and containment protocols, and the logistics of managing multiple simultaneous immerse events across 3 separate territories, and she thought about a creature in the dark of a sealed tunnel, suffocating, sending a 42-second rhythm into the ground, calling something. Fen had said it was looking for the others. The sensor data suggested it had found them. She did not share this in the meeting. Not yet. The meeting was already at its capacity for things it could process. She made a note in her private log and let the meeting run its course. After it ended, she and Fen sat in her office without speaking for a while. "If they coordinated," Fen said, finally. "I know. The Ferris Point approach only works once, maybe twice if we're lucky. If they're sharing information, behavioral, environmental, vector data, the next ones will have seen it. The next ones won't go into the tunnel." "I know," Heian said, "which means we need a different approach." "What different approach?" Fen pressed her thumb against her lip. She had a notepad on the desk, in front of her, half covered in the dense small handwriting she used when she was working, all diagrams and equations and the occasional word underlined 3 times. She looked at it for a moment. "I've been thinking about the tracheal respiration system," she said. "In the first specimen, the sporacular architecture was more efficient than anything in the extant fossil record for organisms of comparable scale. I initially read that as an evolved advantage. More oxygen throughput, higher sustained activity ceiling. But I've been running a second model." She tapped the notepad. "What if the efficiency isn't just a respiratory adaptation? What if the same passage architecture that makes the breathing so efficient also makes it a broadcast antenna?" Heian looked at her. "Freaks of vibration, conducted through the tracheal system, through the ground, through any substrate in contact with the body, a biological ground wave communicator. The 42-second pattern isn't just reaching the others, it's reaching them through the ground, through the ice, through anything they're in contact with." She looked up. "They've been talking to each other through the planet." Heian thought about this. for a moment. She thought about 3 displacement cavities in the ice, 3 kilometers apart. She thought about a behavioral model flagging search patterns across the tundra, systematic coverage, the way you'd move if you were navigating by a signal. Can we jam it, she said. Maybe. If we can characterize the full spectral signature. Fenn's pen was already moving on the notepad. But I think there's something more useful. If the system is bidirectional, if they send and receive, and if we can generate a matching signal, we could steer them. More than that. Fenn looked at her steadily. If we can mimic the signal accurately enough, we might be able to tell them something. The weight of that sat in the room for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did at this altitude, pushing against everything, testing edges, looking for the place that gives. The sound of it was the sound of persistence. Like what, Hayan said. Like, stop. Hayan thought about a creature 90 meters long that had moved through the tundra with precision, that had calculated options and made decisions, that had sent a structured signal from the dark of a sealed tunnel in its last minutes. She thought about what it would mean if that signal had been received. If something out there in the ice had heard it and understood it and adjusted its behavior accordingly. She thought about 4 displacement cavities in 3 separate ice sheets, chain, and the monitoring station that had gone offline 6 weeks before anyone was looking, and the creature in the first cavity that had been heading south-southwest in a search pattern before it found the station, before the station found it, before everything that came after. She thought about what it meant to be the first, the scout, the one who woke up first and moved out and sent the signal back and never came home. Fenn, she said, I want to propose something to General Moss that he's going to find extremely unusual. You want to try to talk to them. Before we try to kill 2 more of them in tunnels, yes. Fenn was quiet for a moment. The odds of a meaningful signal exchange in a time frame that prevents. I know the odds. And if the signal we generate isn't accurate enough, if it reads as hostile or as the original specimen in distress, and it triggers a coordinated response from multiple organisms simultaneously, then we're in a worse position than we're in now. Hayan folded her hands on the desk. We're already in a position where the Ferris Point method is a one-time play, and we have at minimum 2 more emergence events in progress, and possibly 4 more we haven't located yet. We can try to tunnel all of them, or we can try the thing that has a non-zero chance of not requiring us to kill everything that wakes up. Fenn looked at her notepad. She looked at the window. She looked at Hayan. I'll need to record the Ferris Point sensor data at full resolution. I'll need the signal processing team. I'll need 6 days minimum to characterize the spectrum well enough to generate a plausible matching signal. She paused. And I'll need you to get me access to the organism in the tunnel. The organism is still in the tunnel, yes. The xenobiology teams have been working around it. I need to be in direct contact range with an active sensor array for at least 12 hours. She looked at Hayan without blinking. I'll go in. The compound concentration inside is still at 30% above threshold. I'll wear a suit. Fenn, the organism is still structurally intact. The spectral signature from the Ferris Point data is our only template. If I'm going to generate a signal that sounds like one of them, I need to hear one of them. She picked up her pen. I'll go in. Hayan looked at her for a long moment. Desh goes with you, she said. Fine. And a full safety team outside the eastern portal. Fine. And you check in every 30 minutes. Fine. Fenn was already writing. I'll want to go in tomorrow morning. Early. They went in at 0430, 4 days after Ferris Point. The eastern portal blast door raised by 3 meters, and Fenn walked into the tunnel, carrying a sensor array in a hard shell case, and a portable signal analyzer, and wearing a sealed pressure suit that made her look like she was going to the bottom of the ocean. Desh beside her in a matching suit, carrying the power pack for the array, and the kind of expression that had given up on performing calm and simply doing the thing. The tunnel was quiet. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of something very large breathing very slowly in the dark, ahead of them. The emergency lighting had been restored to the eastern third. Past the grade break at 70 meters, they worked by helmet lamps, and in the helmet lamp beam, the surface of the creature's carapace ahead of them was amber and enormous, and seemed to go on past the edge of the light in both directions. Heian listened to the comm from the monitoring station, 150 meters away, behind sealed doors, Dae-jung beside her, because she had not asked him to be there, and he had come anyway. Fen set up the array at 62 meters, 4 meters from the nearest surface of the carapace. She calibrated for 18 minutes without speaking on the comm. The first communication from inside was her saying, "Passive scan running," in a voice that was normal and level and gave nothing away, and Heian breathed through her nose and waited. They stayed in the tunnel for 14 hours. What Fen brought back, when the blast door came down behind her, and she walked out into the cold morning air and pulled off her helmet and stood for a moment just breathing, clean mountain cold. What she brought back was 67 gigabytes of spectral data, and the look on her face that Heian had come to recognize as the look of someone who has understood something they had not expected to be true. She didn't say anything for 10 minutes. She sat on the bumper of a transport vehicle and drank water from a bottle and looked at the mountain. Then she said, "It's still sending, 42 seconds. The pattern hasn't changed." "What does that mean?" Heian said. Fen thought about this for a moment. "It means it still believes there's someone to receive it." She looked at her. "Which means either the others haven't responded yet, can't tell that they have. A pause, or both." She stood up and picked up the hardshell case. "I need the lab," she said. "And I need 4 days." She needed 3. The signal model Fen built in those 72 hours was, by any technical standard, extraordinary. A mathematical reconstruction of a biological process no one had known existed, built from sensor data and informed inference, and the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that made Fen the scientist she was. Heian didn't pretend to follow the technical architecture. What she followed was the output, a signal that, when played back on the array at the appropriate frequency and amplitude, matched the Ferris point template at 91% confidence. And response. When Fen the first test broadcast from the array positioned 20 meters from the tunnel's eastern portal, a 6-second pulse, at 91% match, the ground sensors inside the tunnel showed a response within 8 seconds, not 42 seconds, 8. An immediate change in the signal pattern, a break in the rhythm. They ran it again. Different response, slightly different pattern, the same immediacy. They ran it a third time. Inside the tunnel, the creature moved, not toward the blast door, not in distress. It moved in the way it had moved across the tundra, deliberately, purposefully, and repositioned itself, and the new position placed its primary thoracic mass 2 meters closer to the array-facing wall. "It moved toward the signal," Desh said, very quietly. "It heard us," Fen said. Heian was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about 40 people in a settlement that was still there. About Cadet Piers Yuen, who had stayed for the sensor data. About a creature that had moved through the world like it knew where it was. Because it did, because it was old, and it was smart, and it had woken up in a world that had tried to kill it, before it had a chance to decide whether it wanted to cause harm, and maybe it hadn't. "Build me a message," she said. "What kind of message? Tell it. The others are still in the ice. Stay." Fen looked at her for a moment with the expression she had when she was recalibrating her model of Heian Park. "I can try to encode spatial information," she said slowly. "A directional signal that points north. And I can encode the equivalent of a stop signal. The pattern the first specimen used when it held position in the tundra before the drone contact." She paused. "It won't be language. It'll be the suggestion of meaning. An argument made in instinct." "That's enough," Heian said. "Start with that." They started with that. What happened after? The long and complicated and politically improbable sequence of events that eventually became the Ferris Point Accord, and then the Northern Ice Treaty, and then the 12-year project that Fen would lead, and that would reshape every framework anyone had ever used to think about intelligence and time, and what it meant to be alive on a planet that kept more secrets than its inhabitants suspected. None of that was visible from the monitoring station on that November morning when Heian Park and Fen Soraya and Desh and Dae-jung stood outside a tunnel in a mountain range and listened to the ground. What was visible was this. The ground signal inside the tunnel changed. The 42-second rhythm slowed, and then it stopped. And then, after 17 minutes of silence, a new signal began. Not the same pattern, something different. something none of them could characterize yet. Feast that Dash would spend the next 3 months analyzing. That would eventually be classified in the preliminary literature as a response class signal, distinguishable from the search class signal by its shorter period and narrower spectral range. In the early papers, this signal class was labeled acknowledgement. Hayan didn't know any of that standing in the cold outside the tunnel. She knew that the signal had changed, and that the creature had not moved toward the blast door, and that the other displacement cavities, tracked hourly by satellite, had not opened. She knew that they were still here, all of them. In the ice, in the tunnel, in the monitoring station, in the mountain range under the blue autumn sky, still here, all of it still in motion, still unresolved, still dangerous, still everything. But here, she picked up her comm. She had calls to make. Dae-jung was standing next to her, looking at the mountain. "Think it understood," he said. She thought of his 42-second rhythm sent into the dark of a sealed tunnel by something that believed, despite all evidence, that there was still someone to receive it. "I think it wanted to," she said. "That's enough for now." She pressed the call button.